Solidarity with Venezuela condemning the recent U.S. aggressions against the country has grown over the past week. Over 6 million people have signed the petition rejecting President Obama's March 9th executive order arbitrarily declaring Venezuela a threat to its national security. Millions of people have also tweeted in support of the Latin American country. On Friday, the U.S. expressed disappointment that most countries are backing Venezuela and not Washington.
Sexual practices such as sex parties with prostitutes by the United States military personnel in Colombia, which were recently revealed in a report by the U.S. Department of Justice, do not come as surprising for historian Renan Vega.
It is the typical behavioral pattern of an imperialist power such as the United States on a subordinated territory where even women's bodies become a target of oppression, a target of domination.
For Vega, it is not just about sexual relations with prostitutes, as revealed by the U.S. Department of Justice report, but beyond that, and even worse, are the sexual assault cases, which in Colombia have been taking place since 1999, when the so-called Plan Colombia bilateral agreement opened up the gates for the arrival of U.S. military personnel that engage in what Vega calls sexual imperialism.
That means that the establishment of the commercialization of women's bodies, which are subordinated to the power of dollar, but also to the blackmail implied in the presence of U.S. troops that proclaim themselves as superior.
For researcher on women and conflict Maria Eugenia Ramirez, the biggest concern is that the abuses and sexual crimes committed might go unpunished.
It's very likely that it ends up in impunity, as the advisors and military personnel of the United States have immunity as a result of the bilateral agreement signed.
Ramirez highlights the importance of clarifying the U.S. responsibility in Colombia's armed conflict, especially in the wake of the peace process underway in Havana.
As negotiations to bring to an end to the armed conflict are underway in Havana, it is important and necessary to demand compensation and justice regarding what happened with the United States military forces.
For historians and women rights advocates, there is nothing revealing in the U.S. Department of Justice's latest report, but the question that remains is whether or not there is going to be justice regarding the role of the United States in Colombia's armed conflict. Natalia Margarita, Telesur, Bogotá.
Natalie Condori is a representative of Congress who left the ruling party to join a new coalition, and argues that leaving the party was necessary to be able to push for the proposals that she promised in her electoral campaign.
In our current government of President Ollanta Humala, in which us Peruvians placed a lot of hope for change, unfortunately, what we have seen is a move from the right that was already in place with the previous governments of Alejandro Toledo and Alan Garcia to an extreme right.
Like Condori, another tough Congresspeople abandoned the ruling party. Such desertion meant that Humala's party did not have the majority in Congress, with only 34 out of the 130 members. And even though Humala's policies have become more rightist, it was also right-wing members of Congress who voted to sack the Prime Minister.
What is happening is with the right. It was more or less predictable. The right has used and continues to use him, but doesn't feel as if one of them. And the more subservient Ollanta Humala becomes, the more they have disdain for him, and the less consideration they have for him. I believe he doesn't even have the capacity to negotiate his surrender, his submission to the right, and these are the consequences.
Ollanta Humala has a difficult path to follow, according to most analysts, because of the lack of control in the legislative body and the slowdown of the economy. The situation is aggravated by a series of social protests, such as labor strikes and indigenous and farm workers' protests demanding the exit of transnational companies in the extractive sector. Rael Mora, Telesur, Lima.
Greece's left-wing Syriza government is considering scrapping the euro and introducing its own currency unless the eurozone tones down its demands for the country's debt negotiations. Sources close to Syriza said the government is also considering nationalizing the country's banks. The Greek administration has vowed to defend the economy of its people versus accepting austerity measures that the rest of the EU has imposed on the country.
You know very well what negotiating means. We are negotiating for the future of Greece at this moment, just like some negotiated, or rather did not negotiate, in 2010 and 2012.
President Barack Obama assured Americans on Saturday that a newly negotiated framework for a nuclear pact with Iran was a good deal. He is seeking public support for a diplomatic breakthrough, and many in Congress oppose. Obama pressed his case that the deal would ensure Washington's longtime foe would not be able to build a nuclear weapon.
This week, together with our allies and partners, we reached a historic understanding with Iran, which, if fully implemented, will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon and make our country, our allies, and our world safer.
Despite that world leaders and organizations have hailed the preliminary nuclear deal reached Thursday with Iran, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to reject any agreement with Iran. He assures that Iran will ultimately produce nuclear bombs, posing a threat to the Middle East. Netanyahu proposed that an additional condition be imposed on Tehran in the final deal, which is to be signed by the June 30th deadline.
Israel demands that any final agreement with Iran will include a clear and unambiguous Iranian commitment of Israel's right to exist.
As the Saudi-led airstrikes on Yemen entered its 10th day this Saturday, the number of victims continues to grow, while the foreign intervention appears to have done nothing to alleviate the crisis in the embattled Arab nation. The UN has reported over 500 dead and thousands injured, mostly civilians, due to the airstrikes. The International Committee of the Red Cross has accused Saudi Arabia of not allowing humanitarian aid to reach the people in dire need. They also called on a 24-hour ceasefire, saying the wounded were dying due to lack of medicines and doctors.
After days of fierce clashes, Islamic State group has taken control of 90% of a Palestinian refugee camp on the Damascus outskirts, where 18,000 civilians have suffered violence for years. The most powerful extremist group in Syria, Islamic State, is now only a few kilometers from President Bashar Assad's seat of power, posing a serious threat to the capital and the government. The situation at the refugee camp is grave, as refugees have been unable to access water or food for days, while the lives of thousands, including children and women, are in danger, according to the United Nations.
Now all the houses have been damaged. Craters are all over the streets and windows have all been smashed. There are no shops, no shelters. Isn't it sad?
Thousands of Kenyans are mourning the close to 150 people that were killed Thursday during the Al-Shabaab extremist group attack on Garissa University, which has drawn international condemnation. Kenyans have criticized the government for failing to protect its citizens from extremists, who on Saturday vowed to carry out more attacks. Dozens of parents were still searching for students who are still unaccounted for.
We are trying to search her. The list we have seen, she's not there. Up to now, I don't know where she is. But we are not giving hope. We are not giving hope. We want to have hope that she should be found alive or dead somewhere.
An Egyptian court began a retrial on Saturday of former President Hosni Mubarak and his sons for corruption. They're accused of diverting public funds earmarked for the renovation of presidential palaces to upgrade family properties. Mubarak, who is now 86, was toppled in a 2011 popular uprising, and in May of last year he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. His two sons were given 4-year jail terms in the same case.
In many countries around the world, stargazers were able to enjoy the third total lunar eclipse in a row Saturday. The fourth will occur September 28th, forming the so-called tetrad, or a series of 4 total lunar eclipses in a row. Since the 1st century, 61 tetrads have been registered. This one will be the 62nd, and the next one is not expected to happen until 2032. The celestial body took on a burnt orange tint, giving the moon the appearance that earns total eclipses the blood moon nickname.